I'm Dr. Justin Mark Smith, Associate Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Azusa Pacific University. What are ancient biography and why do they matter? Ancient biography is a, a set or a subset of literature that develops over a roughly 800-year period from about the 4th century BCE to about the 4th century CE. During that time, we see a wide variety of presentation. But in many ways, what we see are some significant commonalities, I think, that hold this body of literature together. So, biography, ancient biography specifically, are really interested in presenting the life of an individual, presenting the life of the individual, and most often in positive terms. There are occasions where we get negative biographies, where we have individuals being presented in such a way as to be cautionary tales, if you will. But more often than not, biographies are used as a way of presenting individuals as exemplary figures, exemplary moral figures, exemplary ethical figures, oftentimes exemplifying high character in a wide variety of contexts and approaches. We see this from philosophical characters and individuals to military and political figures and individuals. I think part of the reason why this literature is so important is that it really sets the groundwork for understanding that in the Greco Roman world, there is this interest in and emphasis on individuals and telling the story of the individual. And biography is really interesting in that it includes very typically both the words and the deeds of the individual. So it's this coming together of what an individual says and what an individual does as a way of distilling the essence of the individual. So what is included there will be that which is necessary to really get at the core of who that person is. And why I think that's interesting for us, and where I think it intersects for us with biblical studies, is I see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the canonical Gospels, as examples of Greco-Roman biography. And what that does for us then is it shifts the focus of our study, at least in part, of the Gospels to the central figure, the central character, which is Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. And so by writing in that biographical genre, the gospel authors are signaling to both ancient readers and now potentially to us as modern readers that what we should be paying attention to is the subject, Jesus. So, where I think the impact falls for us as modern readers in understanding the gospels as biography is that I think, again, it shifts the focus to Jesus. So, in many ways, over the last roughly 100 years, maybe even 200 years of Gospels research, I think there has been this shift away from the Gospels in many ways being about Jesus and being about lots of other things. So I think coming out of some of the initial searches and work and quests for the historical Jesus, there was this feeling that the Gospels lacked historicity, that the Gospels were too theological, that the Gospels really couldn't be used to say anything meaningful about Jesus as a historical figure or historical subject. And as a result, this shift became one of perhaps understanding the form of the Gospels from a literary perspective, maybe, or focusing in on gospel audiences, or trying to understand what the Gospels said about early Christianity, and in many ways, sidelining Jesus in the process of saying that the Gospels maybe gave us some access to Jesus, but not as much as we would like. And I think part of the problem there was by viewing the Gospels as histories and maybe even modern histories, or putting the Gospels into that larger sort of modern historical conversation, we obscured what the original authors were trying to do. And I think what the authors were trying to do was certainly work within a historical space, but to do so in such a way to talk about Jesus, to draw the audience into understanding Jesus better. This is who he is. This is what he did. This is what he said. And perhaps one of the payoffs then would be seeing Jesus as someone worthy of following or emulating or imitating. And so, even in the ancient context, then this idea of drawing the reader or hearer into imitating Jesus, I think, is part of the main point. And as we, as modern readers, then look at the Gospels, we may not think they're particularly good biographies. We may not like what Mark or Luke or Matthew or John does within the genre. They may not be as good a writer as Plutarch or Suetonius or many of the other Greco-Roman biographers that we point to. But just the fact that they aren't as good a writer, let's say, as any of those others, doesn't mean that what they do isn't important, and it doesn't mean that what they're not doing is drawing us again to Jesus. And so I think it helps sharpen our focus, at least in part, on who Jesus is and how Jesus is being presented by each of the gospel writers. I think one of the big questions ultimately when we start to reorient our reading of the gospels towards a biographical reading again is, what is the payoff? And so I think you could really look at any moment, any snapshot, any pericope in the Gospels and reframe that reading and say, what are we learning about Jesus here? Or what is this particular author trying to display about Jesus here? Or what is this author trying to say about Jesus here? And that sort of becomes the reformatting question or the framing question through which we start to read the Gospels. So instead of reading a particular narrative, maybe let's say something about the Last Supper in any of the gospel accounts, and looking at it and framing it within the context of early Christian practice or early Christian ritual, which of course is interesting and important and is certainly embedded in some way in this narrative. If we reframe that by saying, what is Mark or what is Luke or what is Matthew trying to say, trying to demonstrate about Jesus in this narrative, then again, it opens up, I think, those narratives to putting the emphasis back on Christ. So if he takes a cup, if he blesses it, if he passes it, it's certainly not just about the Passover. I mean, that's a huge part of it, but it's also something in that moment, thinking about the larger context. What does it say about Jesus's mindset? What does it say about his approach to the end? What does it say about his relationships with the others in the room? How does it demonstrate his willingness or his engagement with the end of his own life? What is important to him at that point? How would that have fit within the larger structures and expectations of the Greco-Roman world? And then what can we glean from that as modern readers? So I think, again, it allows us to ask a certain set of questions. And I think that's what's so key about this is it allows us to frame and reframe the questions in light of who Jesus is or how Jesus is being presented within this narrative structure, within this biographical framework, and allows us to bracket off other questions in different ways.